Welcome to Football's Golden Oldies from the Toll House in Lancaster. Today's talk is about Mick Channon. This is Mick Channon's story. Mick Channon's authorised biography is packed with hilarious intimate anecdotes and spine-tingling achievements. The first thing Mick Channon ever asked Peter Batt was for a tip. What's this old geezer Sir Alf Ramsey really like then, Batty? Mick had good reason to ask, because he was about to make his debut for the England under-23 team, which was managed by the old knight himself. Peter Batt said something along the lines that Alf was the Prince of Darkness, who treated the press as he would a dog turd beneath his heel, yet at the same time his chosen few, the England players, regarded him as some kind of Mother Teresa figure, who would protect them from the masses at the Football Association and the rest of the world in general. Peter Batt then said, typically, this most generous-spirited of men made a bit more sporting history by agreeing to let me write this biography, for which he sacrificed much of his precious time, and then refused to accept a penny piece in payment. He has, however, instructed the publisher to donate an agreed sum to charity on his behalf. Early days. Michael Roger Channon was the middle one of three boys, who according to his mother Betty were the be-all and end-all of their parents' world. This is backed up by the younger brother Phil, who says, during our childhood, Dad had two jobs. He drove a lorry for the army by day and worked on a farm in the evenings lifting hundredweight sacks of grain. All three boys were born in a tiny thatched cottage in the village of Orcheston, Wiltshire, on Salisbury Plain. John in 1944, Mick in 1948, and Phil in 1952, who said, Dad died suddenly of a heart attack, but thankfully not before Mick had repaid him and Mum for all those early sacrifices. As an old cavalryman, Dad was so happy when Mick and Jill used to invite Major Hearn and his wife to dinner, and the pair of them yarned on about their old army days. All three Channon boys were natural athletes. At school, Mick was good at everything, sprinting, long jump, high jump, pole vault, and John was the same, but the one long-term memory that far outweighs all the others for Mick and Phil was the tragic death of their brother John. John had been helping a local farmer when a tractor, loaded with hay, overturned and crushed him. Mick had always been an extrovert, but now he went into his shell, developing deep powers of concentration, perhaps as an escape from thinking about John. Signing for Southampton. When Mick moved from the village junior school to a bigger secondary modern, he was head and shoulders above most of the boys for miles around when it came to natural soccer talent. The two clubs nearest to Mick's home were Swindon Town and Southampton. Both fancied the hell out of this skinny, sensationally swift-footed kid. Bert Head was the manager of Swindon Town, and he thought he had Mick's signature in the bag. He was going to sign Mick on a Monday morning, but Ted Bates, manager of Southampton, nipped round to the house on Sunday evening to sign Mick. It was illegal to sign schoolboys on a Sunday, so Ted arranged a photograph signing session in a local cafe on Monday. As it turned out, brash young Mick did not have long to wait to turn his dream into reality, becoming the youngest ever player to turn out for Southampton reserves when he was just 15, and a year later he was in the same first team as Terry Payne, his idol. The first lesson young Mick Channon learned about becoming a professional footballer in the 1960s, you had to develop the necessary social skills to succeed as a piss artist par excellence. As for the ball artist bit, that came naturally to him. Alehouse footballers. The shock of switching from school milk to milk stout still remains with him to this day. I just couldn't believe how many first-teamers turned up for training nursing hangovers, nor what bullies so many of the old pros were towards us kids. Cleaning their boots was bad enough, but when it came to clearing up their sweaty socks and jock straps, pinching your nose was as important as buttoning your lip, and God help you if you didn't knock on the door before you went into their dressing room. Mick Channon was entering a veritable academy in the art of getting rat-ass, so much so that his beloved Saints were disdained to be christened the Alehouse Brawlers by legendary Liverpool manager Bill Shankly. Southampton happened to have more excess boozing baggage in the shape of the then famous pop group the Wurzels, who regaled their heroes with choruses of "Drink Up Thy Cider," a drunken ditty that they performed regularly on television. The closest thing to a current superstar was Terry Payne, a fringe member of Alf Ramsey's 1966 World Cup squad, who incidentally won all of his 19 caps while Saints were playing in the unfashionable second division, a feat that would be unimaginable today. Known as a little shit, Terry Payne was the best player I ever played with or against, asserts Mick. Payne lasted for 18 unbroken years, clocking up a record 713 league games for the club, but he was known as a little shit by almost every opposition player with whom he ever came face to face, and he was called even worse than that by those who never saw him coming before he put the boot in. Terry had great pace and could beat 4 or 5 players with his trickery, and even David Beckham had nothing on him when it came to crossing the ball. But as a sly, foul tackler, this slightly built man with a sadistic streak running through him lived up to his name and was on practically every opposition player's personal hit list. They could never catch the dirty little sod, though, grins Mick. One of Mick's best mates then and now was Brian O'Neill, a tough little midfielder who claimed he could feel no pain. He played for England under 23s, the Football League, and was on the fringe of Alf Ramsey's all-conquering England squad. Mick remembers, Brian was the only professional footballer who never owned his own pair of boots. Every match day he would rummage around for some boots to nick, and you had to be on your toes to make sure he didn't pinch yours. His drink in those days was vodka and water, and he could really lash it down. Into Europe. Southampton may have been a bit of a rag-bag outfit, but they qualified for the first cup in 1969-70, being drawn against Portuguese side Guimarães, whose ground was north of Oporto. The alehouse 16-man squad was presented with a bottle of vintage port on the pitch before the game, which ended 3-3 with goals from Channon, Davis and Payne. The home leg was won 5-1 with goals from Davis 2, Gabriel, Channon and an own goal. Southampton went out in the next round to Newcastle on away goals. By the way, none of the bottles of vintage port came back to England, as by the time they arrived back in Oporto, everyone, players, press and directors, were all pie-eyed. Mick's introduction to first-team football came on Easter Monday, and he scored against Bristol City to help Saints into the First Division for the first time in their history. Channon had lost count of the number of goals he had scored before he left the Dell, 11 years after his debut. Unknown to him, he had hit 199. Mick said, "If I'd been counting, I would have stayed on a bit longer for my double century." Strangely, for someone like Channon, who later in his English career professed to hate Scotland and the Scots, he made some very close friendships with several. First Jimmy Gabriel, then Asa Hartford at Manchester City, and Jim Steele in the Saints FA Cup winning team of 1976. Still drinking. Apart from being a great drinking buddy of Mick's, Jimmy Gabriel was every inch a Scot, a stubborn devil, and Channon hated him at times. He always wanted to be the best, and the only Englishman who was as intense about the game as Gabby Gabriel was Alan Ball. One Sunday lunchtime, the alehouse lads were in their local boozer, as they did every Sunday, when Gabriel said, "I have to lose weight, so after this session I am giving up the booze." He was as good as his word until the following Friday. He staggered into training, reeking of booze, and his mates demanded an explanation. Jimmy gladly told them the story. "I was sitting on the sofa last night, the wife had gone to bed, watching the High Chaparral, when a cowboy ordered a bottle of whiskey, swallowing it in one go. So I went to my drinks cabinet, lifted a bottle of scotch, and downed it immediately. But I was so legless I couldn't get out of the chair, so I threw my shoes at the ceiling to get the wife down and drag me upstairs to bed." Mick said, "I remember the late great Danny Blanchflower once saying that when you finish playing, the rest of your life is paying up time. And if me and my old alehouse mates had to do it all again, most of us would probably not change a single thing." Saints. Down at the Dell in the 1960s, young Mick Channon's star was rising season by season. Whilst he was still a teenager, he scored 8 goals in one season, 1967-68. The following season he notched 12 more, and, as if to mark his ascent into manhood, he scored 21 in his 21st year in 1969-70. Mick went at defenders from all angles. He was the fastest young gun in the business. Just as impressive was his consistency. His form never seemed to dip, and his seasonal goal tallies from 1970 until he was transferred to Manchester City 7 years later were 20, 17, 18, 23, 29, 25 and 25 again. He had a variety of striking partners during that time, like Welsh international Ron Davis and England stars Martin Chivers and Peter Osgood, who found themselves playing second fiddle to him. One thing that worried the club's bosses was that when they tried to sign new recruits, they had to overcome the reluctance of some of them to join the club because they had heard the advice which spread around the game's dressing rooms. "Whatever you do, don't sign for Southampton, or the stench in the changing rooms will suffocate you." The rumour was that Mick Channon and his racing buddy Brian O'Neill came into training every day reeking of horse shit after they had mucked out their horse boxes early in the morning. Black market tickets. Shannon's hands should have been the ones wrapped around the 1976 FA Cup when it was raised aloft at Wembley, but in asking for a transfer he also relinquished the captaincy. There is another ironic little twist to that cup final glory, in that it was the last time the Queen ever presented the trophy, and in view of her later connection with Channon, it would have been even more apt if he had picked up the cup on behalf of his team. Mick's other less pleasant memory of the events surrounding the magical occasion was his part in the perennial scandal of the sale of black market tickets. Today, he says he understands and sympathises with the fans who could not get a precious ticket and could not afford the black market price. Mick adds, "I would be a liar if I claimed I had never sold a black market ticket, and so would every other player I knew back then. The feeling about building a nest egg for when your playing days were over were very intense for all of us." Mick was in Malaysia with the Saints, with his mates Ball and Keegan, when they heard that Fat Stan Flashman, the king of ticket touts, had been robbed of hundreds of black market tickets at gunpoint. The instant collective reaction was to say, "We hope our names weren't printed on the back of them." I believe that all tickets allocated to players should be traced back, and they should be charged and never get another FA Cup final ticket, even if they appear in a final in the future. Lead up to the final. The fact that Mick recalls more about the birth of his filly than the 1976 Cup final itself is the biggest clue as to what really makes Mick Channon tick. Horses will always take precedence over football in Mick's psyche because his soccer skills were an inborn gift from the gods, whilst racing was his man-made obsession. As a football personality, he will always be remembered for the one-armed whirling windmill gesture to celebrate a goal. Peter Osgood, incidentally, reckons that Mick stole that trademark from Pete Townsend of The Who. Mick counters with, "I will have to take his word for that because, as a dinosaur member of the Al Jolson and Frank Sinatra fan clubs, and I cannot recall ever seeing Pete and his musical mates in action. But brother Phil says, the reason for Mick swinging his arm that way was simply because he was never fit enough to be able to do somersaults like Robbie Keane." On the Friday night before the game against Grimsby in a pedestrian second division league game, Mick, who was an avid Southampton fan himself, invited all the players to his hotel room and announced, "This is the proudest moment in my football career, and I think we should all be celebrating big time, so the drinks are on me." They all staggered out of Mick's room at 5 o'clock in the morning of the match, legless. As the noise from Mick's room reached the ears of manager Laurie McMenemy, who was at his pre-match talk, said, "You lads should be fully ashamed of yourselves. There are thousands of fans out there who have travelled half the country today. And do you know why? Because they are so effing proud of you. That's why. Shame on the lot of you." Repercussions. Mick recalls, "Laurie certainly succeeded in making us feel ashamed, but physically we couldn't raise ourselves to play in the first half. There were more back passes and sideways balls than there were in the entire season. We were dead lucky to go in at half-time with the score 0-0. Laurie ripped into them again. I can't even look at you. I'm not even sure I want to be your manager anymore. To which Mick replied, don't worry, Gaffer, we'll put it right this half. In the second half, Mick went out and scored 4 goals, and with Bobby Stokes chipping in with another, the Saints ended up winning 5-0. Afterwards, Laurie didn't know whether to laugh or cry. All he could do was keep repeating, you lucky bastards, you lucky, lucky bastards. And as Mick always liked to have the last word in an argument, he cracked back at McNenemy, if the lager hadn't run out at 5 a.m, we'd have won 9-0. Osgood recalls the time he decided to verbally tackle Channon about his selfish style of play. The reply was, sorry mate, I just can't help myself. The instant I see the whites of those posts, I just have to go for a goal. How ironic then that years later, when he had a torrid time at Manchester City, one of the main reasons for his dip in form was the fact that City wingers Peter Barnes and Dennis Truart did the party pieces rather than passing to Channon to put it in the net. FA Cup victory. The handicap that Osgood and Channon suffered from was peer pressure. If you wanted to enjoy a good relationship with your pals in the dressing room, you had to adopt macho poses and attitudes that had always predominated when a group of like-minded guys get together. Our trouble was that we reached our lifetime's earning peak at a time when most of us had no inkling of what a lifetime were going to amount to. We were reckless with our money, Mick said fatalistically. It was, in a way, even more ironic then that the late and much lamented Bobby Stokes, a modest local boy, should score the only goal of such a star-studded final. His goal was one of the very few highlights of a cat-and-mouse encounter that never caught fire as a spectacle, and it was mostly down to the fact that the mice won it that it got such a prominent place in the annals of FA Cup history. Full of bravado, big bad Jim Steele, Channon and Osgood had nicked the FA Cup by telling the security man it was needed for a photo shoot, saying, after that the three of us went on for a few more berries, and you can imagine how I felt when I opened my eyes to a desperate hangover the next morning, and there on the sideboard next to my car keys, my loose change, and a few crumpled fivers stood the gleaming FA Cup. As Jim Steele says, I did get it back to the Dell safe and sound eventually, but it was a case of better late than never, and I suppose that just about sums up the twilight of my career with Mick and the other alehouse lads at the dear old Dell. Laurie McMenemy. Laurie's previous club was lowly, unfashionable Grimsby Town, and the most accurate description of his unusual talents was provided by Mick. Laurie had this gift of taking experienced players and squeeze them like an orange, knowing that better, older players retained their form whilst youngsters had emotional highs and lows. He was a good listener, but he enforced a real army-style discipline brought with him from his previous life in the military. The irrepressible Osgood and Laurie's other big-name signings were to transform the Saints, as near as damn it, into as close to a glamour team as the small-town club could ever hope to get. Maybe it was the fact that Laurie himself had only ever played in the lower leagues. He was an extremely shrewd man. He had a vision of what he wanted to achieve and stuck to that ideal. It paid off for him that at one time he held the record as English club football's longest serving manager. Mick had a taxi driver as a pal called Larry the Cab, real name Bob Charles. He had played for Southampton and was England youth goalkeeper, but he smashed the bones in his left arm in 3 places and was forced to retire from the game long before he reached his prime. Mick began forming small owners' syndicates with some of his Southampton and English teammates, and Bob was appointed as both manager and gopher for the little syndicates. England. When Mick Channon's old pal Kevin Keegan found the job of being England manager too much for him and resigned, one of the main criticisms levelled at him was the amount of off-duty card games in which he allowed his players to indulge. But Mick contends Keegan was simply doing what came naturally. Channon was an England regular for over 5 years under 4 different managers and found that playing cards for money came as naturally as breathing to almost all the players. It would certainly seem that betting and boozing was so endemic in the British working class that there was no way a British football manager was ever going to even think about changing things. Of all the gambling men who ever pulled on an England shirt, Stan Bowles must have been the most infamous. It was shortly after Revie had introduced his infamous pre-match dossiers. Each member of the squad was required to memorise every detail, so Stan Bowles and Mick Channon threw them into the waste paper baskets in the hotel bedrooms. Mick was too busy reading his breeding brochures anyway. England were to play an important World Cup qualifying match against Italy in Rome in 1976, which they went on to lose 2-0, and Revie's world fell apart. Shortly afterwards, he jumped ship going to Saudi Arabia to secure his financial future. I call it betraying his country. World's End. During his professional involvement with sport, there have been 3 truly black armband days for English football. They were the 1953 tutorial from Hungary, when the magical Magyars inflicted on England a first ever defeat on home soil by the world-shattering scoreline of 6-3. Then there was the 3-2 extra-time quarter-final defeat by West Germany in the scorching heat of Leon, Mexico. And finally, an autumnal night in October 1973, when 100,000 fans packed into the old Wembley Stadium could only stare in mute disbelief as England trooped off the field after a 1-1 draw with Poland that plunged England into the World Cup wilderness for the rest of the 1970s and virtually ended the illustrious career of England's greatest ever manager, Sir Alf Ramsey. Before his England career eventually came to a close, Channon was to score 21 goals for his country, a record that puts him in joint 18th place on the all-time list of England goal scorers, alongside Steven Gerrard and his old buddy Kevin Keegan, who will wince when he is reminded that Mick's total came in 46 matches, whereas Kevin had to make 63 appearances to equal it. The birth of the Windmill celebration started when Ted Bates used him as a lone striker in a 1-9-1 formation, and Mick says, "Most of my goals came after long runs which left me breathless, and I used to swing my arm to try and get some air back in my lungs to relieve the tension." Manchester City. It was beside a hotel swimming pool on the edge of Copacabana Beach, where the turning point for a dramatic change in Mick Channon's life happened on the morning after starring for England in a 0-0 draw against Brazil at the legendary Maracana Stadium in June 1977. He was nobbled. Not that he minded, because the man doing the nobbling was about to offer him a deal that was to make him the highest paid player in England at the time. Kevin Keegan remembers the incident this way. It was the most blatant tap-up job I've ever seen. Peter Swales approached Mick in front of everyone. Swales was the leading member of the official FA party and the all-powerful chairman of Manchester City. Mick signed in July in 1977 for £300,000. Swales would, of course, have been hung, drawn and quartered for that if it had been reported to the authorities. But the times were changing. Even the England manager, Revie, was setting up the shady deal that was to see him scarf her off to the anonymity of the desert in Dubai. And Keegan had just been transferred to Hamburg in one of the first transfer deals to be conducted through an agent. That same agent offered Channon a £60,000 signing-on fee plus around £50,000 a year basic to join Bordeaux. But at 28 and in his prime, country boy Mick wasn't prepared to go abroad, and even less inclined to pay the agent 10% of all monies involved. Time at City. Instead, he found himself in Swales' lovely house in Altrincham, Cheshire, nervously listening to an offer that had him tingling with excited anticipation, as he was lured by a 3-year contract at £43,000 a year and £100 a point, and playing for a team like City, who had finished runners-up in the top division in the previous season. That meant an almost guaranteed 60 points a season. So at £1,000 a week, he became the highest paid player in Britain, and with the money City were also paying into a pension fund for him, which meant that he would never have to draw the dole, no matter what might befall him in later life. But the record £300,000 transfer fee City paid for Channon was broken only a few days later, when Liverpool signed Kenny Dalglish from Celtic. Peter Swales loved wheeling and dealing. People said he was a dictator, but his kind of trading as chairman proved to be suicidal for Manchester City in the end. What a poetic irony, then, that when Mick's old English colleague Franny Lee made the final phone call that brought him control of Manchester City from Peter Swales, these two old playmates just happened to be sharing a bottle of champagne together on holiday at Franny's house in Barbados. Mick maintains, City were a great club when I was there. Nothing was too much trouble for anyone. The whole staff, from secretary down to the groundsman and the tea lady, were tremendous. The only problem I had was on the pitch. To put it bluntly, I wasn't worth 2 bob. Worst setback of his career. To cap everything, not long after he arrived at City, Channon sustained the worst setback of his career, a pelvic strain that kept him out of action for 6 weeks. On reflection, Mick reckons he was lucky because he recovered from that injury, and it was an injury that had finished a lot of other players' careers. When he returned to the first team, he remembers being kicked black and blue on the field and enduring terrible verbal abuse off it. Chants from the terraces of "what a waste of money," and he had only been there 6 months. Football-wise, he didn't have a very good time, but it turned him from being a rather spoilt boy into a man. His brother Phil was looking after his 4 broodmares that still included Caffy Jane at his little stud at Lower Chase Farm, not far from his country roots in Swanmore. Strangely enough, it was when Malcolm Allison arrived at City to begin his second spell as manager that Mick's form took a distinct turn for the better. Although Mick never rated him as a manager and was disdained to fall out with Big Mal, he nevertheless responded to him by sweeping in 11 goals in Allison's first 13 games in charge. Allison was flawed. Mick said Allison was always wanting to put square pegs in round holes, and I thought he had finally disappeared up his own rectum when, on a pre-season tour, he came up with another new playing toy to satisfy his strange curiosity. The toy was a lad called Barry Silkman, who became a soccer agent, but who was virtually an unknown winger via Hereford, Crystal Palace and Plymouth. Big Mal's brainwave was to play Barry as a continental-style sweeper. Mick soon let him know that it was the most ridiculous experiment in the history of football, whereupon Allison blew his top and put Mick on the transfer list. Inevitably, it was to be old Father Time who was to be the judge of their personality clash. He found in favour of Channon. Whilst Mick's star was still rising, Allison's had waned. After tipping the brim of his fedora, puffing on his Havana cigars, Mick heard that he was in poor health and living in impoverished circumstances. But when you are a nasty piece of work on the ladder to fame and fortune, do not expect any sympathy when you come back down the ladder. Mick thought, in my view, being full of himself is a very different thing from being selfish. As well as being a taker, Big Mal was a giver. He was never less than the best of company. He always loved a bet as much as I did. Second coming. It wasn't long before Mick Channon was sold back to Southampton in September 1979 for £175,000. The Saints were by now in the First Division. If you will forgive the minor blasphemy, amongst my favourite football stories is the one that claimed that when the slogan "What will you do when Jesus comes to Liverpool" was posted outside a church near Anfield, some wag had scrolled underneath it, "Move St John to centre forward." Well, some of the more fanatical Saints fans had already invested Channon with divine power by sporting a banner at every home game which read, "Jesus saves, Channon nets the rebound." Mick found a very different Laurie from the one who had waved goodbye. Laurie had grown into the job and come so far since his own departure that Mick started calling him the Ayatollah. No sooner had he signed him back than Alan Boyle was signing for Saints after a successful stint for Vancouver Whitecaps in the North American Soccer League. Mick said, "At one time great pals in the England squad, we were teamed up again for 3 smashing years with the Saints, during which we qualified for Europe twice. Then to cap it all, the season after I returned, Laurie snapped up my old England roommate Kevin Keegan as well. It wasn't long before the 3 of us were back in harness as horse racing partners." Three blinding years. They turned out to be 3 blinding years for Mick. The attacking football they played was turning fans on all over the country. Mick even scored the ITV goal of the season. Began to fall apart when Laurie and Kevin fell out so badly they never spoke to each other again for many years. Mick remembers, as both Laurie and Kevin were used to getting their own way, the big bust-up between them was inevitable. It came when we played Wolves in a bank holiday game late in the season and got a rare home beating. Laurie said after the match, "You lot didn't even try today," at which Keegan exploded. His pride had been hurt, but it was wrong to react the way he did. How ironic then, in the second half of his life, Channon had turned into a workaholic. Ever the straight talker, he said. To be honest, I never rated Laurie too highly when he first came to the Saints. Still, he was a good listener, and he learnt something from every player who worked under him. But who am I to talk about the big man that way? I was just a big-headed young git myself in those days, so it was just as well I had to endure a lot of ego deflation in my short spell at City. Mick had always been very lazy and never practiced his shooting. Most of his football was purely spontaneous, off-the-cuff stuff. He didn't plan or try to analyse it. The odd trio. As football players, Mick Channon, Alan Ball and Kevin Keegan were about as much alike in style as chalk cheese and a packet of Lineker's potato crisps, if they were horses. Mick Channon would have been the languid, silky smooth miler, Ball would have been the stoutest stayer in training, and Keegan would have been the explosive sprinter. Laurie said the thing that set them apart from other players was that they were all supreme athletes. The common bond was that they were very strong personalities, but Mick has to be the most revered player in the club's history. A local boy with charisma, a great sense of pride in and loyalty to Southampton, always focused, knew where he wanted to go in life and brooked no argument about it. Mick, Kevin and Alan have had a million laughs on football grounds and racetracks together. But as owners, both Kevin and Alan know that when it comes to the serious bit, they sit on the fence and let Mick do the talking. You don't tell Channon, the trainer, to do things. You ask him, and even then you usually wind up with an earful of swear words for your trouble. Keegan chuckles and says, "I remember being in a horse box with him, and as usual he was swearing away like he always does. I spotted a real lady standing behind him, a genuine member of the aristocracy, so I gave him a dig with my elbow. Mick turns round and says, 'You'd rather hear language like that than be a effing deaf, wouldn't you, darlings?' The lady just creased up in tears of laughter." Travelling. The now almost old-fashioned telephone is still the most deadly of instruments in these high-tech times. Most people learn what destiny awaits them when they answer its ring, and so it was for Mick Channon when he received a phone call at home from Laurie's secretary, telling him that the boss would like to see him in his office the next morning. Mick remembers that as he replaced the receiver, he had one of those weird "for whom the bell toll" premonitions. Before reporting to the manager, he shared some black humour with Alan Ball, saying it was possible the prelude to a new contract. But then he put the proviso, then again, it might be the dreaded free transfer. He was right on the second count when Laurie said it was time they parted company again. This time, though, there was to be no move to a glamorous club like Manchester City, only the slippery slope of the glass mountain that all veteran players dreaded. Soccer economics was on the downturn. Mick was on the wrong side of 30. His wage of £60,000 a year would be enough to buy the Saints 3 pairs of younger legs, and although Mick might have not liked his sudden departure from the Dell, he had to pick himself up and get on with his life. It was no use moaning because nobody would listen. Still travelling. Although Mick was still steeped in breeding, the idea of training horses for a living had still not reached the twinkle in the eye stage. He was to find that there were at least 5 more good, bad and indifferent years as a full-time footballer still to be travelled on his incredible sporting journey. Mick Channon, the player, was to go on to appear for Newcastle United, Bristol Rovers, Norwich City, Portsmouth and Finn Harps, as well as travelling to almost all parts of the globe to earn his living the only way he really knew how, for he had already tried and failed by teaming up with Peter Osgood for a venture into the meat trade, and another crack at sports shop ownership, this time with the equally conventional dodgy partner from outside the game. His travels took him to New Zealand and Australia, where he first met Willie Hastings Bass, who you will hear more about later in this talk. The most unlikely of Mick's travelling tales is the one in which he and dear old straight-laced Trevor Brooking became partners. Mick recalls, "Trevor and me found ourselves in New Zealand together. We used to do a double act as guest after-dinner speakers. Trevor, being Trevor, played the straight man, of course, whilst I was the naughty boy telling all the blue jokes." The Glass Mountain. The dreaded Glass Mountain that Mick Channon and other veteran players dreaded began to loom inescapably into view for him after he was discarded by his beloved Saints in 1982. The severance of his ties with a club that had provided him with a living and a purpose in life left him between a rock and a hard place. The rock was the lifelong burning ambition for personal fulfillment that still smouldered within him. The hard place was the low level of realistic expectations he was left with to keep that flame burning. And just to make the journey even more perilous, the arch liar, the late and largely unlamented pension robber Sir Robert Maxwell, also chose to throw in a banana skin. As chairman of Oxford United, Maxwell cynically took the opportunity of staging a mock interview with Mick to offer him the job of manager of his second division team, a job that Mick believes Maxwell had no intention of giving him. Mick recalls, "He was just using my name for cheap publicity. The old devil even had pressmen making notes and photographers taking pictures of our meeting." Long term, Mick was fast becoming just another seen it, done it, bought the t-shirt old footballer who just happened to breed and own a few horses as a hobby. But the fact is, nobody asked him to do a job for them. He was out on his ear. Attempted rescue. First up with an attempted rescue was Kevin Keegan. He arranged for Mick to try his luck as a part-timer with Newcastle, that sleeping giant, for whom he was now playing his trade. But with just 4 second division appearances and 1 goal, Mick found himself back in the shit, shoveling shit again back home with his horses. Bobby Gould was next in the frame, trying to lure Mick to Bristol, who agreed to go there on a part-time basis, training 1 day a week. He played 4 games, no goals, but by way of compensation, Bobby got his club some short-lived publicity out of the brief liaison. Then he accepted an invitation to go racing with Alan Ball at Fontwell Park in late December 1982. With Alan was another racing nut in the muscular shape of Peter Shilton, who had recently joined Southampton himself. As the drink flowed, Mick took his bad mood out on his mates, but Shilton retaliated with some tough love talk that had a life-changing effect on Channon. Peter said, "Mick, you are a lazy git. You should give the shit shoveling a rest and get back into training every day." Mick says, "I brewed brooded on the truth of what Pete had said all next day. Then, wouldn't you know, the phone rang with an offer for me to meet Ken Brown, manager of Norwich City, the next morning. Christmas Eve. Next day was Christmas Eve. His car was off the road, so he hired a Mini, squeezing his overweight frame into it for the long journey. The roads were jammed with Christmas shoppers, but Mick thought about what the Canaries might offer. A return to the First Division, he would snatch their claws off. Norwich were bottom of the league, but Mick was needed to play on Boxing Day because strikers John Dean and Keith Birchin were injured. So Mick was thrown into a red-hot East Anglian derby. They won 3-2. Mick didn't score, but next day against Luton Town he scored in a 1-0 victory. Channon was on a month-on-month rolling contract. He got back into serious training and played regularly for Norwich for the next 2.5 years, scoring 16 goals in 88 games. Ken Brown told Mick, if it wasn't for the chairman, you wouldn't be here. Norwich managed to finish halfway up the table that season, and when later City went to Wembley to play in the League Cup final, and as Mick picked up his winner's medal, he said, I don't know who was happier, me, Sir Arthur South, the chairman, or my son Michael. Michael Channon Jr. was 10 years old when Michael Sr. arranged for him to be on the Norwich bench when they played Sunderland on that Sunday afternoon Milk Cup final. He even did a lap of honour after the game with his old man, following their 1-0 triumph. Relegation. Although Mick and Jane had joined together to make the Milk Cup final fun for their children, the couple's marriage had by then run its course, although Mick and Jane remain good friends and still are. Sadly for Norwich, though, that season ended with tears of despair as well as tears of joy when they were relegated. And even more sadly for Channon, this financial disaster for the club meant that after 2.5 years he had to wave goodbye to what he describes as my days of sanctuary with my lovely Village Green team. One of the more obvious reasons why Mick was so happy in Norwich was that he met his present wife Jill whilst he was playing for the Canaries, and they settled down to plan a life together. Mick also had an excellent relationship with the crowd at Carrow Road. The peace and tranquillity of those East Anglian years suited Mick, and when he stayed in Norwich instead of a long drive home, he stayed overnight in a charming little hotel called Oaklands. The owner, George Dack, loved horse racing almost as much as Mick, but unfortunately Channon kept tipping him losers, saying, sorry about that, George. Back with Alan Ball. Amazingly for a frontrunner, Mick Channon still had one last hurrah left in him at the age of 38. Ball, who was managing Portsmouth in the second division, and according to Mick, his old mate had put together a dirty dozen of rejects and ne'er-do-wells that nobody else wanted. Channon said it was just like the old alehouse days at Southampton, as if I'd come full circle. Naturally enough, on the July morning that Alan rang Mick, it happened to be Monday following glorious Goodwood, and Mick was expecting Bally to discuss racing, but Bawley said to him, get your ass down here, the chairman wants to see you, so you might as well join us for a month. So Mick went to see the chairman, John Deacon, and he was soon back in business. Channon describes the tactics. Every one of those Pompey lads was a fierce competitor who would hurl himself into the thick of a match quite blindly at times. They didn't know or care how to play for a draw, and that cost them promotion. It gave Channon a great deal of pleasure to see them do right for Borley when they finally clinched that precious First Division spot for him the very next season by finishing second to Derby County. Channon was not around to share in that triumph, however, for by then the old warhorse had finally retired from the fray for good to nurse his wounds and mull over his future. Little did he know then what wounds and what a future they would turn out to be. A disgusting policy. Cortisone was a pain-killing drug that has since been banned and has blighted the lives of too many former stars to be named here. It was a disgusting policy in most clubs then to pay unfit players over and over again by sticking so many cortisone injections into their injuries that many of them must have finished up with legs looking like dartboards. Mick's most memorable recollection of this terrible trend was when his foot was shot full of the deadly liquid, so that his bruised big toenail could be ripped off in the White Hart Lane dressing room before game between Southampton and Tottenham Hotspur. He went to play for 70 of the 90 minutes before the excruciating pain returned and became unbearable. Unlike a dozen more of his half-crippled mates who have suffered long-term effects of these football injuries, Channon has, of course, gone on to be one of life's winners despite having to hobble about and pop pills in his constant daily battle against arthritis. It was during the last part of his spell at Portsmouth that the idea finally settled in his mind that he must somehow try to get a living out of his other love, racing. He was in a worse state mile-wise than so many of the old end cars he had burned out travelling the length and breadth of the country as a part-timer. He knew it was time to settle down and become a professional racing man. Where did his love of horses begin? Mick got hooked on horses early in his life, around the same time he was pulling on his first pair of football boots as a paid apprentice professional. The horses walked through his village every day. An elderly trainer called Richmond Sturdy stabled them just over the hill from the Channon household. But Mick was also attracted by the stable girls, one of whom whispered into his ear a tip for the Ebor handicap, Tintagel II, which became the subject of the first ever Channon anti-post wager at 100 to H, which soon shrank 6 to 1 when it became known that the maestro, Lester Pickett, would be the jockey. Mick's inquisitiveness was fed by answers from assistant trainers Paul Cole and Neville Callaghan. So just as so many young pro footballers whiled away their time in snooker halls, Channon found himself becoming more and more familiar with horse boxes and got to know more about them thanks to a jockey called Frank Morby, and with Ted Bates at Southampton, they fashioned Mick's incredible double sporting life. At the same time, he palled up with now legendary trainers Richard Hannon, assistant to his father Harry and David Ellsworth, who drove the horse box for Vernon Cross, and they met up and drank together whenever they were off duty. A double sporting life. Ellsworth remembers, he had and still has a quick temper, can be aggressive, very determined and very energetic, all qualities which made him a successful soccer star and just what the doctor ordered too as far as training workhorses. But the greatest thing Mick has going for him in his present profession is that he knows how to take it on the chin when he loses. He doesn't like losing, but he takes it like a man. If anyone has to beat him, I'd rather it is Channon or Hannon. Richard Hannon is everything Mick aspires to be. A former champion trainer, the Queen's trainer, a multi-classic winner, and as Mick says, an all-round good old boy. Old match master Richard Hannon beams with pride when he is reminded that Mick gives him and their joint pal David Ellsworth the credit for teaching him most of what he knows about training racehorses. Hannon says, I suppose the main thing I taught Mick was that you have to have horses right across the board, and that when you have them, you run them. They are no good sitting in the yard. They say Mick and I have a lot of runners, but the answer to that is we have a lot of winners too. Money-wise, though, it will always be hard for us to beat the likes of Sir Michael Stout and Mark Johnson, who usually get the better horses sent to them. Caffey Jane. It was in the early 1970s that Mick Channon bought his first racehorse. The only other material possession that the then 22-year-old Channon owned was an Austin A35 car. Everyone was advising him to go for bricks and mortar, but he was so enamoured of the racing game that he could not envisage life without the thrill of going to a race meeting whenever the opportunity arose. Mick's racing sidekick, Frank Morby, marked his car the next window cleaner called Ken Payne, who had started training at West Wellow near Southampton, had some yearlings in his possession. So Mick persuaded his soccer sidekick, Brian O'Neill, to go halves with him on one of them. Mick and Brian agreed to name the filly after their wives, Caffey O'Neill and Jane Channon. The fearless pair of alehouse lads paid £200 each for Caffey Jane, and she changed Shannon's life so completely that he said, everything I went on to achieve in racing was down to her. Though after winning some serious racing and giving birth to a string of winners herself, she eventually turned into as grouchy an old cow as you were ever likely to clap eyes on. Caffey Jane proved so disappointing that Mick and Brian decided to sell her and cut their losses. But by the time they had reached their decision, all the sales were over and they were lumbered with the filly for another year. What happened to Caffey Jane? It was the last chance saloon scenario when the trainer, Bill Whiteman, booked that peerless stylist, Joe Mercer, to ride her at Bath. Mick bet £30 on her to win at 7-1. As they came out of a dogleg, 3/4 of a furlong out, Caffey Jane was in the lead, when suddenly the favourite veered right across the course, bumping into her, who was then forced into another horse who went on to win. Joe Mercer advised them to lodge an objection, and the decision went in Caffey Jane's favour. More importantly, Caffey Jane proved to be such a stout stayer that she went on to win 4 important races, and when she won at Gloria's Goodwood, Mick had to use all of his fame and charm to talk his way into the owner's and trainer's enclosure because he was improperly dressed. Caffey Jane's day of days came when she won the prestigious Brown Jack Stakes at Ascot in the summer of 1973. Mick remembers, I don't know who was more knackered afterwards, her jockey Willie Carson, Caffey Jane, or Brian and me, and that season Willie Carson was champion jockey. Caffey Jane was to go on to become the catalyst for Mick's success as a breeder. In addition to his West Ilsley stable, he now owns and runs a 120-acre stud in West Tivoli, Wiltshire. At the time of Kathy Jane's success, Mick thought he would never be able to afford to buy another horse, so he decided to breed from her because she had been so well bred herself on her dam's side and was by an Italian Derby winner, Lauso. The rest is history. Mick sent Kathy Jane to a 7-furlong handicapper, Mandamus, and from him she produced a man on the run, who would go on to win 3 races on the flat and 3 over jumps, and was placed on more than 20 occasions. Another one of her sons was James Mead, who finished second in the Cesarewitch and won the Tote Gold Trophy. Mick fondly remembers, when Kathy Jane became a broodmare, she was even more bitchy and moody than she'd been as a racehorse. In all, she had 7 foals, and every one was a colt, which meant, of course, that I never had a filly to go on breeding from her. All her 7 colts turned out to be winners, but they were the end of the line before she fractured a leg and had to be put down. But for the £400 she cost, she turned out to be worth her weight in gold. Before winding up his reminiscences on his beloved Kathy Jane, Mick records one last anecdote. One day, as usual, I was shouting and roaring my head off in the stands during one of her son's races, so much so that afterwards Bill Whiteman advised me to become a football manager when I finished playing, saying sarcastically, "Michael, I've discovered something about your horses today. They all love being shouted at just like you footballers do." Mick's syndicates. One of Mick's syndicates bought a jumper named Sparkoff for £6,000, trained by another friend, John Baker, in Devon. The horse's first race was a disaster, but the horse was entered at Devon and Exeter on New Year's Day 1980. The Saints were playing Arsenal that day, so Mick couldn't put his bets on, so he arranged for Larry the Cap to bet them all over the town. Larry or Bob visited over 30 betting shops in the morning, making up little cock and ball stories that he was betting for his mother, his grandma, and Uncle Tom Cobley and all. Sparkoff stormed home at a starting price of 12 to 1. Channon won more than £7,000, which was big money in those days. One other little betting story concerns the time Mick and Peter Osgood backed his horse James Mead in the Cesarewitch. They were playing at the Dell and the race started 30 minutes after kick-off. So they arranged for one of Ozzy's mates to signal the result from the stands. Sure enough, as Mick went to take a throw in, a big red-haired bloke was jumping up and down in the seat, sticking 2 fingers up at him. Mick was shocked, thinking, "Okay, maybe I'm not on top form today, but I can't be playing that bad." It was only when Ozzy nudged me that I realised we finished second, so that was what the red-haired bloke meant with his dodgy hand signal. The winner is... Spent leaves flutter down to lay beside dead betting slips, turning the grandstand floor into a field of broken dreams. This is the last week of the flat. This is mood indigo. There's still more than a spark of life left in the 2003 season for 2 prominent racing men. They are Mark Johnson and Mick Channon, who are locked head to head in the struggle to finish as this year's top trainer in Britain. One race is about to decide the outcome, staged at Musselburgh, the little seaside course just outside Edinburgh. recently modernised to such a lavish extent that it is staged in the first ever listed race in its 187-year history. It has been run over 2 miles and is called the Willie Park Trophy Stakes in honour of golf's first ever Open Championship, as Park played his golf here at Musselburgh's Links course. Shannon's Mr. Nando wins it by 3/4 of a length from Johnson's Scots View, and in the process stacks up enough statistics to satisfy even the most diligent of racing anovaks. His victory means that Mick Channon has beaten Mark Johnson with 140 winners to 139. Mr. Nando has claimed the Channel 4 trophy as the horse that has won more races, 10, than any other this season, and his owner, John Duggan, is presented with an exact replica of the claret jug that is the prize for the golfers who win the Open. Mr. Nando's jockey, Sam Hitchcock, is stood down by the stewards for the rest of the meeting because they rule that he was exhausted, and Channon had gone one better than last year when he finished second to Johnson in the winning trainers table. Day at Royal Ascot. Mick was not even present at Musselburgh to witness his ultimate racing triumph. Instead, he was in the sunshine of Dubai, comforting his wife Jill, just days after she had undergone an operation for breast cancer, as less than a week earlier, Jill had gone for a routine medical check, only to be told she needed an immediate operation and she was under the surgeon's knife within days. His yard had 2 group winners, 3 Royal Ascot successes, and finished second in the 2000 with Safine. But Mick is obsessed with the future and simply puts the past, whether good, bad or indifferent, down to experience, saying, "Needless to say, I was absolutely thrilled about the season's successes. But right now, all I can think about is having Jill fit and well again, and work-wise, concentrating on the 100-plus 2-year-olds we've just broken in for next season. Oh, and one other thing, collecting a monkey off my old mate and mentor Richard Hannon the next time I see him. We have a bet every year on who will train the most winners, and this is the first time I have beaten him, so naturally I'm hoping it will be the first of many." If every life has a defining moment, Mick Shannon's came on a midsummer's day at Royal Ascot, when he rode down the straight mile in a royal carriage as a guest of Her Majesty the Queen. Then, as his carriage approached the grandstands, most of the punters began chanting, "There's only one Mickey Channon," whilst the gentlemen in the royal enclosure raised their top hats as one, with military precision, and a few even shouted, "On me head, Channon, on me head, son." Dinner at Windsor Castle. The prelude to this momentous occurrence came a few weeks earlier, when a posh voice on the phone invited him and his wife Jill to lunch at Windsor Castle with Her Majesty the Queen. Mick's first instinct was that it was a wind-up by one of his best pals, either Alan Ball or Kevin Keegan. Mick's first reaction was to address himself in the vernacular with an astonished cry of, "Well, I'll be effed." The first thing he did when he put down the phone was to fax Jill saying, "Would you like to join me for lunch with the Queen at Windsor Castle, darling?" Jill remembers, "I bought the most expensive outfit of my life. It cost £1,000. Then it was off to Paul Treacy, a top London milliner, for a £600 hat, which had to be dyed to match my suit." Mick counters with, "When we first arrived at the castle, Jill was in such a state of high excitement she was almost sick. I knew that feeling from my own playing days. so I tried to calm her by saying it would all pass in a blur, like it did for me when I played for Southampton against Manchester United in the 1976 FA Cup final. Jill, incidentally, is the only person who calls her husband Michael. She explains, I can't stand Mick or Mickey. Michael has a much classier tone to it, and he always says I'm the only bit of class in his life anyway. Jill continues, as we were a little earlier, an equerry took us on a tour, pointing out the famous paintings. Next, we were taken to the drawing room for cocktails, where we talked with Harry Herbert, youngest son of Lord Carnarvon, the Queen's racing manager. Meeting the Queen. Jill remembers it well. When the Queen Mother, and Princess Margaret joined the party, we were ushered into the white dining room. Michael and I were seated well away from each other, so it was definitely every man and woman for himself and herself. Mick said every time I glanced Jill's way, I could tell she was feeling as highly strung as an unraced 2-year-old at the starting gates. As for Mick, he spent most of the meal chatting with John Howard, Prime Minister of Australia, who seemed to know a lot about Mick's football career. And Mick thought one of the equerries had marked his card beforehand. Mick had learned in his few years as a trainer that diplomacy was an absolutely essential skill when it came to keeping a diverse group of owners happy. During the pauses between conversations, Mick could not resist stealing wide-eyed glances at the Queen, Princess Margaret, and of course the great racing fan, the Queen Mother herself. And for some strange reason, he found himself repeating under his breath the timeless words of that age-old nursery rhyme, "Pussycat, pussycat, where have you been? I've been to London to see the Queen." And then he continues with a laugh, "So you have, my son, so you effing have." A sense of humour and a laugh were never very far away from Mick Channon. Tea in the royal box. Mick takes up the story. There were 4 horse-drawn coaches laid on to take us to the course, and Jill and I got into such a muddle that I ended up in the 3rd coach and Jill in the 4th. Mick was struggling to enjoy the moment because he thought Jill had been left behind. His worries were unfounded because Jill told him that people mistook her for Princess Diana under her big hat, and this had her giggling with delight. She didn't know then, of course, that Diana would be so tragically killed 2 months later. Mick is quick to acknowledge that the rest of the fabulous day belonged much more to Jill than him, as she recounts. Tea was taken at several small tables in the royal box, and I was invited to join the Queen at the top table. Jill asked Her Majesty if she was going to Cowes, but the Queen reminded her that this was the year that Britannia was going out of service. Multi-billionaire John Paul Getty II had loaned the Queen his yacht as a replacement, and Mick's daughter from his first marriage had worked on John Paul's yacht for 10 years, and her partner was the captain. The next time Mick was to receive the royal summons, that kind of small talk was to be superseded by conversations of a much more serious nature. Telephone call. Again, it came via a totally unexpected telephone call. This time the man on the other end of the line was the Queen's cousin, Lord Huntingdon, one of racing's most popular eccentrics and known throughout the sport as Willie Hastings Bass. Willie had succeeded the legendary Major Dick Hearn as the Queen's tenant at West Ilsley, and had been very successful too. His most notable achievements have been to win 3 successive Ascot Gold Cups with Indian Queen in 1991 and Drum Taps in 1992 and 1993. He surprised Mick by telling him that he was retiring and going to live in Australia, and then he surprised Mick even more by asking him if he fancied buying the stables. To an aspiring racing man like Channon, that question was tantamount to, do you fancy winning the lottery? The difference here was going to be the price of the ticket. Mick assumed it would be way beyond his financial reach. He vividly remembers his own reaction to the call. Willie heard my gasp of astonishment, followed by a long pause, and then my answer of who wouldn't, but I couldn't possibly afford it. Undeterred, Willie kicked on with, one of your chic owners might be able to help you out. Just come over and have a look. Deal. Mick started thinking that perhaps a peak wouldn't do any harm, but then Willie virtually knackered his sales pitch by asking, why don't you bring Jill over too? Mick knew that as much as he loved Jill, and she loved him, there was no way she would leave their house in Lambourne, having just finished lovingly fashioning it for herself and her 2 young children, Jack and India, but she agreed to take a look. As Willie showed them around, he kept stressing its historical significance. Among the relics that had been uncovered during its various developments were a human skull under the spiral staircase and a headless skeleton in the old garden. Jill was handed documentary information that the original manor of Hodcut was mentioned in the Domesday Survey, was held by Ralph de Mortimer in 1086 until 1425, when it passed to Richard, Duke of York, and the Crown became possessed of it in 1497. Mick thought, as a kid who was born in a cottage on Salisbury Plain and then brought up in a council house, this was all starting to do my brain in. The briefing started to get a little less scary. It did have enormous potential for redevelopment. Would a deal get done? A few days later, Lord Carnarvon himself rang Mick and asked if he had liked what he saw, and was he interested in buying. The tone of Mick's answer made Lord Carnarvon sense his mixed emotions, so he said, put in a bid. Then a few days later, his lordship rang again. What happened to your bid? So Mick said West Ilsley was way out of his league, so Lord Carnarvon repeated very firmly, put in a bid. So Mick did that, and to his astonishment, negotiations began soon after, conducted by his accountant, John Lisby, and the bank, and by the Queen's land agent, Richard Morris, and by the keeper of the privy purse. Coincidentally, Mick ran into Willie Hastings Bass again at the Royal Ascot meeting in 2003. You can't help greeting him with a smile. Such a lovely fellow. He's an amusing eccentric. He once cycled across a South Sea island for charity, and after the Bosnian War, he drove a lorry full of food and other supplies to the Balkans. Mick regards Lord Huntingdon as one of those life-changing catalysts that keep turning up in a person's life when you need them most. I first got to know Willie in Australia when I was playing for a team called Warwick Farm. At that time, I was on what you would call the slippery slope. I was prostituting myself at the end of my career and earning a few quid for the rainy days which were just around the corner. So maybe my old agony uncle remembered those days too, when he persuaded me to buy West Ilsley. West Ilsley. Sometime like Sometime later, when Lord Carnarvon asked me to come and chat with the Queen at Newmarket races, she asked me how things were progressing at the stables, and I had to confess that I had upset a few of the locals because some of my lads had got pissed and fallen in a village duck pond. The Queen replied, "So I've heard," before advising Mick not to worry too much about it, because a similar thing had happened with Dick Hearn's lads in the old days. First thing I did when I got home was to phone my mum and dad and tell them that they were moving from Salisbury into one of my bungalows at West Ilsley. By then, Jill had hired an architect, structural engineers and builders, and spent 10 months going backwards and forwards from Lambourne to West Ilsley every day. She's now able to describe Hodcut House as her dream home. Stables. In spring and early summer, there is no setting more glorious in which to start a working day. On such mornings, Mick Channon feels he is taking a liberty by just being alive. The breaking dawn paints the gallops gold. The air is crystal clear, and the silence is broken only by birdsong. But on most mornings, this soothing scene is suddenly vandalised by the raucous Wiltshire twang of the trainer, who is swearing non-stop at the work riders. This industrial language is not the only relic of Shannon's earlier life as a star footballer. He's limping heavily, half crippled by his old football injuries, and he has zoomed up the handicap weight-wise, though having to hump around at least 4 stones extra these days. As the string snorts past, you can feel, almost as intently as the riders can, the hot, sweet breath flooding up from the dark wells and the nostrils of nature's most wondrous creation, the thoroughbred racehorse. You know precisely why the Queen chose to stand here on so many occasions when she owned the place. If you let out enough rein on your imagination, you can see the Duke of Cumberland exercises his horses here hundreds of years ago, and then strain your ears even harder than your eyes, and you can pick up distant echoes of the sound of King Alfred and his warriors locked in battle with the Danes much further back in time. And now Mick has Arab owners amongst his patrons. It is thanks to Mick and some of his pals like Richard Hannon that racing has at last rid itself of so much pomposity and arrogance that once riddled the sport. There is still so much rubbish talked about in this industry, but not from the likes of Mick and Richard. Brother John, never forgotten. Outside of Greek mythology, Mick Channon must be the nearest thing to a centaur that the human race has yet produced. The only other 2 half-man, half-horse creatures that this country has managed to conjure up are Franny Lee and Mick Quinn, both incidentally former teammates of Shannon's. Recalling the pair's almost parallel lives, Franny Lee, who is 4 years older than his mate, says, "Mick Channon stalked me all my life, stalked me into the England team, stalked me into the Manchester City team, and even stalked me into racehorse training." They both made their first team debuts as 16-year-old boy wonders. Lee for Bolton Wanderers, he played 625 games, scored 297 goals and notched up 150 winners over both flat and jumps in his 8-year training career. Lee says training a winner at the races gives you a bigger adrenaline rush than scoring a winning goal in even the most important of football matches. It has to be said that the downside to the training game is too many bad owners. But I shouldn't think my old mate Mick will have to put up with too much of that anymore, because he really is in the Premier League of the racing game now, and long may it last for him. All these years later, Mick says, There is never a day passes when I don't have fleeting thoughts of my dead brother John. We were inseparable as kids, and it still hurts like hell that he wasn't able to share in my good fortune. I was 9-year-old when John, who was 14-year-old, died in a tractor accident, and I listened to my mother's tear night after night for what felt like years afterwards. West Ilsley up for sale. Mick Channon has been forced to put his historic yard up for sale. He has been based at West Ilsley near Newbury since buying it from the Queen in 1999. Mick is keen to modernise the yard, but his plans have been thwarted, and West Ilsley was advertised for sale as a whole or in 6 lots in the Racing Post with a guide price of 6.975 million. The advert described a famous horse racing yard at the centre of which is a charming country house with extensive stabling, cottages and office space in 62.72 acres. It detailed a main house with 6 bedrooms plus 4 flats, 2 cottages and 13 bungalows. Equine facilities listed included 105 loose boxes, 35 stalls, a covered trotting ring, lunging ring and covered horse walker. It's on the market. We've tried for planning and been turned down, Channon said. This is a lovely place, but we need to improve it. We're looking to develop part of it so we can make it an up-to-date modern yard. That's what our plans were, but we've walked into a brick wall. On August 27, 2008, Channon was involved in a motorway accident on the M1, suffering a punctured lung, a broken arm and jaw. He was fitted with metal plates to his face, whilst his friend Tim Corby died in the crash. In October 2022, Mick Channon announced that he would close his 33-year career at the end of the season, with his son taking over the licence. In an entertaining book of around 200 pages, Mick took 28 pages to list all of his winners from 1988 to 2004. He had 7 Group 1 Grade 1 wins in Great Britain, 1 in Canada, 4 in France, 1 in Germany, 2 in Ireland and 3 in Italy. In football, Mick Channon won the FA Cup in 1975-76 with Southampton, and in 1984-85 he won the League Cup in the colours of Norwich City. Michael Roger Channon was a true all-rounder. He lived life with a smile on his face, and football and racing were better for him.